Nobody had lived in the house on the hill for 22 years. Everyone in the town of Aldermoor knew this. It was the kind of fact that becomes part of a place's identity over time. Not discussed exactly, but present. Woven into the way people talked about the north end of town, the way drivers slowed slightly when they passed the iron gate at the foot of the long driveway, the way children dared each other to touch the gate and then ran. The house had a name. Local people called it the Harrow House. Nobody was quite sure where the name had come from. It appeared in no official records. It was simply what people called it. The way places acquire names through accumulated use until the name becomes inseparable from the place itself. The Harrow House had been empty since the winter of 2001. That was the year Margaret Voss had died, and the year her daughter had disappeared. Margaret Voss had been 58 years old when she died. She had lived in the Harrow House for 30 years, since 1971, when she had moved there with her husband, a man named Gerald, who had died of a heart attack in 1989, and left the house to her. She had a daughter named Clara. Clara had been 29 years old in 2001. She had lived with her mother in the Harrow House for most of her adult life, having returned after college to help with her father's illness, and then, after his death, having simply stayed. People in Aldermoor who remembered her described her as quiet, bookish, the kind of person who shopped early and left quickly and did not linger in conversation. Margaret had been found in the house in January 2001 by a delivery driver who had noticed the door standing open in the cold. She had died of what the medical examiner ruled natural causes. She was 58 years old and had a heart condition that had been managed inadequately for several years. Clara had not been found. Not then. Not in the weeks that followed. Not in the months, and then the years, and then the decades. Clara Voss had simply ceased to exist on the same day her mother had died. The house had stood empty ever since. The estate had been tied up in legal limbo. No will, no clear heir, no Clara to claim what was hers. The county had eventually taken ownership for unpaid taxes. No buyer had ever materialized. Nobody wanted to buy the Harrow House. The woman who arrived in Aldermoor on a Tuesday in September was 51 years old. She drove a car with out-of-state plates, and she booked a room at the only bed and breakfast in town, a place run by a woman named Patrice, who had lived in Aldermoor for 60 years and knew everything worth knowing about it. The woman gave her name as Helen Drake. She said she was a writer. She said she was researching a project. Patrice noted without comment that Helen Drake had the eyes of someone who had not slept well in a long time, and that she had asked, in her first 5 minutes in Aldermoor, how to get to the north end of town. Patrice gave her directions. She watched Helen Drake's car disappear around the corner. Then she picked up her phone. The person Patrice called was a retired detective named James Okafor. He had worked for the county sheriff's department for 25 years and had retired 7 years ago, and now lived in Aldermoor in the house where he had grown up. He tended a vegetable garden and read detective novels with the particular enjoyment of someone who knows where the author went wrong. He had worked the Clara Voss disappearance in 2001. He had never closed it satisfactorily, not in his own mind. Patrice told him about the woman with out-of-state plates. James put down his book. He drove to the north end of town, Helen Drake was standing at the iron gate when he arrived. She was looking up at the house. Her hands were in her jacket pockets. She had the still quality of someone engaged in an internal conversation of considerable complexity. James parked his car. He walked over. He said, "Beautiful house, when you can see it through the trees." She said, "Yes." He said, "You know its history." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know some of it." He said, "I'm James Okafor. I used to work for the sheriff's department here." She looked at him. He said, "And you're not a writer named Helen Drake?" She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "No, I'm not." They sat in his car because the September air had turned cold and neither of them suggested an alternative. She told him her name, her real name. It was Clara Voss. James sat with this for a moment. He said, "You've been gone for 22 years. She said, "Yes." He said, "Where?" She said, "Everywhere. Nowhere that I stayed long enough for it to matter." He said, "Why did you come back?" She said, "Because I'm 51 years old, and I'm tired of running, and because I found out something recently that I didn't know before. Something that changes what I thought I understood about the night my mother died." She had left on the night her mother died, not because she had done anything to her mother. She was clear about this immediately and returned to it several times in the following hour, the way people return to the things they most need to be believed about. She had left because of what she had found. Her mother had died in the evening. The delivery driver had found her the following morning, door open, cold coming in. But Clara had found her first, hours before the driver, hours before anyone. She had come downstairs at approximately 11 p.m. and found her mother in the armchair by the fireplace and understood immediately that she was gone. She had sat with her for a long time, and then she had done something that she had been trying to understand for 22 years. She had gone through her mother's papers, not to steal, not out of any feeling she could name clearly even now, but because her mother had been a private person who kept things, and Clara had spent her life in that house without ever fully knowing what those things were. And now her mother was dead, and the papers were there, and something in Clara had said, "Now." She had found in a locked drawer that she had opened with a key she found in her mother's jewelry box, a collection of documents that she had spent the rest of that night reading. And what she found had made her run. The documents related to a man named Thomas. Thomas had been, Clara explained, a man her mother had known in the years before she married Gerald Voss. A relationship that had ended badly, according to the letters in the drawer. Badly enough that Margaret had felt the need to document it, to preserve, in writing, things that Thomas had said and done, things she had witnessed, things she had been told by others. The documents were 20 years old at the time Clara found them, written in the 1980s, filed carefully, locked away. They described a man capable of considerable cruelty, of violence that left no visible marks, of the particular intelligence that understands exactly how far it can go before the going becomes evidence. They also described something else. They described a child that Margaret had carried and lost before she had ever met Gerald Voss, before the Harrow House, before any of the life that Clara knew. A child that Thomas had known about and had used in the years that followed as leverage, as a thread he could pull whenever he needed Margaret to do something she would not otherwise do. The child had been born and placed for adoption in 1968. A girl. Margaret had named her in the documents. She had called her Ellen. Clara had run because the documents named Thomas's full name, and because she had known that name. Had known it because it belonged to a man who was, in 2001, a significant figure in the county government. A man whose name appeared on public buildings. A man who had attended her father's funeral and shaken Clara's hand and expressed his condolences. A man who, she had understood reading those documents at midnight in her dead mother's house, had been present in her mother's life in ways she had never known. A man who had leverage, who had used it, who would have every reason to make sure those documents never came to light. She had taken the documents. She had left the house. She had not called the police because she did not know who in the county government Thomas might have influence over, and she was 29 years old and alone, and she had just found her mother dead, and she was not thinking clearly. She had run. She had kept running for 22 years. James said, "Where are the documents now?" Clara opened the bag she had been carrying. She placed a folder on the dashboard between them. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "You've had these for 22 years. She said, "Yes." He said, "Why now?" She said, "Because Thomas died 3 months ago. I read the obituary online, and because I found out something about the child, about Ellen." She paused. She said, "Ellen has been looking for her biological family through one of the DNA databases. She submitted a sample 2 years ago. She said, it matched mine. She said, she found me 6 months ago. She's been trying to make contact. I've been trying to decide what to do." She said, "She deserves to know where she came from. She deserves to know about our mother. And she deserves to know what our mother kept in that drawer for 20 years and why she kept it." She said, "I couldn't give her any of that while Thomas was alive. I was still afraid." She said, "He's dead now." She said, "So I came back." James read the documents that evening. They were exactly what Clara had described. Careful, specific. The documentation of a woman who had understood that she might need proof someday and had prepared it accordingly. They described conduct that, had Thomas been alive, would have been actionable of the 1980s. It was less clear. But the documentation was real, and the history it described was real, and it answered questions that James had been unable to answer in 2001. It answered why Clara had run. It did not answer what had happened to her mother on the night she died. James went back to the original case file. He read the medical examiner's report with the documents from the drawer open beside it. Margaret Voss had died of cardiac arrest. She had a heart condition. She was 58 years old. All of this was true. But the medical examiner had also noted, in a line that James had read 22 years ago and had flagged and then set aside, that there were traces of a sedative compound in her system, in amounts consistent with therapeutic use. Margaret Voss had not been prescribed any sedative. James sat with this for a long time. Then he called a colleague, a woman at the state crime lab who owed him nothing, but who answered anyway. He asked what compound was commonly used in 2001 that would present as therapeutic in a standard toxicology screen and would accelerate cardiac failure in a person with a pre-existing heart condition. She told him. He said, "Can you test for it specifically 22 years later if the tissue samples were preserved?" She said, "Tissue samples from a 2001 case. It depends on storage conditions, but possibly yes." James requested the sample review the following morning. The results took 3 weeks. The compound was present, in amounts that the toxicologist described as consistent with administration, rather than self-dosing, consistent with someone having introduced it to Margaret Voss without her knowledge in the hours before her death. Thomas had been at the Harrow House that evening. This was established through records that James found in the 2 weeks he spent going back through everything from 2001. A receipt from a gas station 4 miles from the house, time-stamped 8:47 p.m. A phone call made from a cell tower adjacent to the north end of Aldermoor at 9:15 p.m. He had been there, and he was dead. The case was reopened formally. Thomas could not be charged. He was dead. But the case could be closed correctly. Margaret Voss's death could be reclassified. The record could reflect what had happened. Clara returned to Aldermoor officially. She gave a full statement. The county waived the matter of the abandoned estate given the circumstances. And she met Ellen. They met for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in October, in a coffee shop in the town where Ellen lived, 3 hours from Aldermoor. James had offered to come. Clara had said no. Some things, she had said, you need to do without a retired detective sitting in the corner. She called him that evening. He said, "How was it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She has our mother's hands." James said nothing. Clara said, "I didn't expect that. I didn't expect to look at a stranger and see something I recognized." She said, "We talked for 4 hours. We're going to talk again next week." She said, she wants to see the house, the Harrow House. I told her I'd take her. James said, "Are you ready to go back?" Clara thought about it. She said, "I've been away for 22 years. I think it's time," she said. "I think my mother would think it's time." The county transferred the deed of the Harrow House to Clara Voss in November. She has not yet decided what to do with it. She drives up to the Iron Gate sometimes in the early mornings and looks at the house through the trees. She does not go inside yet, but she looks. James sees her car sometimes from the road when he drives past on his morning errands. He slows down. He does not stop. She is not there for company. She is there for something else, for the particular work of deciding how to return to a place that holds the whole weight of a life, of figuring out which parts of that weight you carry forward and which parts you finally set down. It takes time. 22 years of running. Takes time to stop. But the gate is there, and Clara Voss is learning slowly and in her own time that she does not have to stand on the other side of it forever. This story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes only.